The map hit the floor of Clarence Calloway's ranch house with a sound like a gunshot. Abigail Norris stood across the heavy oak table from him, her chest heaving, her dark eyes blazing with a fury she had carried for 3,000 miles, and every punishing day of the last 6 weeks on the trail from Boston to the New Mexico territory. The paper had unrolled itself as it fell, and it lay there between them like a battlefield. Every ink line and surveyor's notation her father had ever drawn exposed to the harsh afternoon light that cut through the ranch house windows. "Look at it," she said, and her voice was shaking, not with weakness but with the kind of controlled rage that comes from being told you are wrong by every single person you have ever trusted. "Look at it, and tell me again that my father was a liar." Clarence Calloway did not move. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent 20 years working land rather than sitting behind desks, and he was looking at her, not at the map, and the expression on his face was something she could not read. It was not contempt. It was not dismissal. It was something far more dangerous, something that looked terrifyingly close to recognition. "I never said he was a liar," Clarence said quietly. "You said his survey was wrong. You said the water rights belonged to your family because my father's boundary lines were inaccurate. You had my survey permit revoked by the territorial office 3 days before I arrived. That is the same as calling him a liar." She pressed her fists against the table and leaned forward, every nerve in her body alight with desperation. "That map took my father 11 years to complete. He died finishing it. He died believing that what he had recorded was true. And I came 4,000 miles across this country with nothing but a carpetbag and a surveyor's compass to prove he was right. So look at the map, Mr. Calloway." Clarence finally looked down, and for a long moment the ranch house was absolutely silent. Then he lifted his eyes back to hers, and what she saw in them stopped her cold. It was not anger. It was not the hard, defensive pride she had expected from a man whose land holdings were suddenly in question. It was grief, and it was relief, and underneath both of those things, it was something she could not name yet but would spend the next several months learning to recognize. "Miss Norris," he said, and his voice had changed in a way that frightened her more than any legal threat had managed to, "your father was right." She had not expected that. She had prepared for war. She had not prepared for surrender. Her legs almost gave out beneath her. That moment would become the hinge point of everything that followed, but to understand how Abigail Norris and Clarence Calloway arrived at that afternoon in the spring of 1882, with a map on the floor between them and an empire of secrets about to unravel, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to Boston, and to a dead man's study, and to a daughter who had spent her entire life being told that the truth she believed in was nothing more than sentiment. Abigail Norris was 27 years old when her father died in February of 1882, and she had been his apprentice for as long as she could remember. Edmund Norris had been one of the most respected land surveyors on the eastern seaboard, a man who had worked for federal agencies and private interests alike, mapping everything from river boundaries in Virginia to timber grants in Maine. But the work that had consumed the last decade of his life was not a commission from any agency or any wealthy client. It was personal. It was a survey of a particular stretch of territory in the New Mexico region, land that had been disputed since the territorial government had begun organizing itself in the early 1850s. Land that sat along a river bend and contained, according to Edmund's notes, an underground water source of extraordinary significance. Edmund had told Abigail about the map for the first time when she was 16, spreading it out on the floor of his Boston study, while rain streaked the windows and the fire burned low, showing her the boundary lines he had drawn during a survey expedition in 1871. He had been hired by a man named Clarence Calloway to survey the land around a ranch called the Broken Spur, but what he had found during that survey had troubled him deeply. The land Clarence Calloway claimed to own by virtue of an old Spanish land grant extended significantly farther east than the grant document indicated, and the water rights associated with that land were being used to squeeze out 3 smaller homesteading families who had legal claims to the river access. Edmund had submitted his honest survey results to the Territorial Land Office. The results had been quietly buried. The smaller families had eventually sold out or abandoned their claims. And Edmund Norris had spent the next 11 years updating and re-verifying his original survey from a distance, corresponding with land office contacts and former colleagues who still worked in the territory, because something about what he had found never let him rest. When he died of a heart attack in the first week of February 1882, he left Abigail 3 things. He left her the house on Beacon Street, which was mortgaged twice over. He left her his surveying instruments, a beautiful brass compass, and a set of precision measuring chains that had cost more than most men earned in a year. And he left her the map. He also left her a letter. The letter said, "I believe the Broken Spur land grant is fraudulent. The original Spanish document was altered. The true boundary of the Calloway land ends at Reed Rock Creek, not at the dry wash 3 miles east of it. The water rights legally belong to the public land, not to the Calloway Ranch. I could not prove this from Boston. I could not fight this alone. But you can go, Abigail. You are the best surveyor I ever trained, and I trained you myself. Go to the territory. Stand on the land. Let the instruments tell you what they told me in 1871. And if I am right, do not let them bury it again." She had read that letter 17 times between the day of his burial and the morning she boarded the westbound train at South Station, and every time she read it, the resolve in her chest hardened another degree. The journey west in the spring of 1882 was not romantic. It was brutal and exhausting, and filled with a series of indignities that a woman traveling alone was simply expected to accept. She took the train from Boston to St. Louis, where she transferred to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, riding in a passenger car that smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool, sleeping upright in her seat for 3 nights because she could not afford a sleeping berth after paying for her instruments to be shipped in the baggage car. In Albuquerque, she hired a wagon driver to take her north and east toward the territory around the Broken Spur, a journey of another 2 days over roads that were more suggestion than fact. She arrived in the small town of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a Tuesday in March, and the first thing she did was go to the Territorial Land Office to register her survey permit. The land office was a single-room adobe building with a warped wooden door and a clerk who looked at her surveying instruments and then at her face with equal measures of confusion. "You the surveyor?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Abigail Norris, licensed through the Federal Land Office in Washington. I have a commission to conduct an independent survey of the boundary lines between the Broken Spur Ranch holdings and the adjacent public land along Reed Rock Creek." The clerk had taken her paperwork. He had stamped it. He had given her the duplicate copy that served as her working permit. And he had watched her walk out with an expression that she would later understand had been the look of a man who knew something she did not yet know, a man who had been paid to watch and report. Because within 48 hours of her arrival in Harrow Creek, her permit had been revoked. The revocation notice was slipped under the door of the boarding house room she had rented, a single handwritten page on territorial office stationery, signed by a deputy land commissioner named Gerald Fitch, citing an administrative irregularity in her credentials. There was no specific irregularity identified. There was no avenue of appeal described. There was just the revocation, dry and absolute. She had sat on the edge of the narrow boarding house bed with that notice in her hands and felt the full weight of what her father had tried to warn her about. The system that had buried his honest survey in 1871 was still there. It was still working, and it was already aware of her. She could have turned around. Any sensible person, any person without the specific combination of grief and stubbornness, an absolute devotion to a dead man's legacy that lived in Abigail Norris's chest, would have turned around. She booked no return passage. Instead, she put on her riding clothes the next morning, hired a horse from the livery stable, loaded her surveying instruments into the saddlebags, and rode east toward the Broken Spur. She was going to do the survey with or without a permit. She was going to stand on that land and let the instruments speak. And if Clarence Calloway tried to stop her, she was going to look him in the eye and tell him the truth about what his father had done. What she did not know, riding through the red dust and scrub brush toward the Broken Spur on that March morning, was that Clarence Calloway had already known the truth for years, and that it had been eating him alive. The Broken Spur Ranch was 3,000 acres of hard, beautiful land in a country that did not apologize for its harshness. The grass was winter pale and struggling against the dry cold that still lingered in the high desert at that altitude, but the bones of the place were magnificent. Red Canyon walls rose to the east, and to the west the land opened into a long, grassy valley that caught the afternoon light like something burnished. The ranch house itself was a substantial two-story adobe structure with a wide front porch and a fireplace at each end, built by Clarence's father Harlan in 1863 and expanded twice since then. Clarence was 34 years old, and he had been running the Broken Spur alone since his father's death 3 years earlier. His mother had died when he was 12. He had no siblings. He had a foreman named Pete Garza who had worked the ranch for 15 years and was one of the most competent men Clarence had ever known. And he had a crew of 8 cowboys who rotated seasonally. And he had the land, always the land, 3,000 acres that he knew down to every dry wash and every fence post, and every place where the water ran shallow in summer. He loved it. He also knew, with a certainty that had grown heavier every year since he had read the papers his father left behind, that portions of it were not rightfully his. Harlan Calloway had been many things. He had been a hard worker and a capable rancher, and a man who had built something real from nothing in a country that rewarded exactly that kind of effort. He had also been a man who had paid a territorial land office official named Marcus Webb to alter the translation of an old Spanish land grant document, extending the described boundary of the Broken Spur holdings 3 miles farther east than the original grant had ever intended, encompassing Red Rock Creek and its water rights, and effectively strangling 3 small homesteading families who had been quietly trying to build lives in that valley. Clarence had found the correspondence between his father and Marcus Webb in a locked strongbox under the floorboards of his father's study 2 months after Harlan's death. He had read every letter. He had understood every implication. And he had then put the letters back in the strongbox, put the strongbox back under the floorboards, and spent 3 years trying to decide what the right thing to do was while simultaneously being unable to do it. Because doing the right thing meant losing 1/3 of his land. It meant losing Red Rock Creek. It meant potentially losing the ranch entirely if the territorial courts decided that a fraudulent land grant invalidated the whole claim. It meant the destruction of everything his father had built, everything Clarence had inherited and continued and expanded through 20 years of his own labor. He was not a dishonest man. That was the cruelest part. He was not his father. He had never participated in the fraud. He had inherited it the way you inherit a debt, without choosing it, without knowing it until the interest was already compounding. And now he was carrying it. When Gerald Fitch, the deputy land commissioner who had been on Calloway payroll since Harlan's day, sent word that a woman from Boston was coming to survey the Broken Spur boundary lines with a federal permit, Clarence had made a decision he was not proud of. He had not confronted the issue honestly. He had allowed Fitch to revoke the permit, buying himself time, telling himself he needed to think, to plan, to find some way through that did not destroy everything. He had not ordered it done. He had simply not stopped it. The distinction felt important to him in the dark hours of the night and entirely meaningless in the honest light of day. And then she had ridden up to his ranch house on a horse she clearly barely knew how to manage, with a set of surveying instruments strapped to her saddlebags, and a look on her face that could have stripped paint from the porch railing, and she had dismounted and walked straight up to his front door and knocked. He had opened the door. "I am Abigail Norris," she had said. "My father was Edmund Norris. In 1871, he surveyed your boundary lines and found discrepancies in your land grant. Those findings were suppressed. My survey permit was revoked by your arrangement. I'm going to survey this land anyway, Mr. Calloway, because it is public land and I have every right. And if you want to stop me, you are going to have to do it yourself and look me in the eye while you do it." He had stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at this woman. She was medium height, dark-haired, with eyes the color of old amber and a jaw set with the particular determination of someone who has run out of room for fear. She was dusty from the trail. Her riding coat was not suited to the country, and her boots were Eastern-made and already showing the stress of the terrain. She was holding a brass surveying compass in her left hand the way another person might hold a weapon. He had said, "Come inside, Miss Norris." She had not moved. "I'm not here for hospitality." "No," he had said. "I know. Come inside anyway. There's something you need to see." That had surprised her enough that she had come in. And he had led her to the study, and he had opened the locked strongbox, and he had set his father's correspondence with Marcus Webb on the table in front of her. And then the map had fallen, and she had told him to look at it, and he had told her that her father was right. Now she stood across the table from him with tears on her face that she was furious about, because she had sworn she would not cry in front of this man, not in front of any of them, and here she was crying anyway. Not from weakness, from relief, from the overwhelming bone-deep relief of having someone finally confirm what she had believed through every mile of that terrible journey. "He was right," she said again, and her voice cracked on the word. "He was right," Clarence confirmed. He was still standing on the other side of the table, keeping a careful distance, and his voice was very quiet. "And I have known it for 3 years, and I am ashamed that I did not do anything sooner." She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him hard, trying to find the betrayal, the hidden motive, the trap. Because she had learned in the past 3 years since her father began failing that people who told you what you wanted to hear were often the most dangerous kind. "Why are you telling me this now? You had my permit revoked. You could have continued fighting it. Why tell me the truth?" Clarence pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, as if the conversation had weight he had been carrying on his feet for too long. "Because I saw you ride up," he said. "Because you rode 4,000 miles from Boston alone with your father's instruments on your back to prove he was right. And I looked at you standing at my door and I thought, this woman will not stop. She will not go away. She will find a way to survey this land no matter what I do, and eventually the truth will come out, and if I let it come out through fighting her, I will be no better than my father was." Abigail stood very still. "And the other reason," he said, looking at his hands, "is that I have been living with those letters under the floorboards for 3 years, and it is the worst kind of prison. I am tired of it." She sat down. She had not intended to sit down. But her legs were making decisions her pride was not consulted about. She sat across from him in the ranch house study with the map between them and the strongbox open and the letters spread out, and she said, "What do we do now?" And that question, simple and practical and terrifyingly open, was the beginning of everything. What followed was not simple. Nothing about the situation was simple, and anyone who told you that correcting a decades-old land fraud in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 was a straightforward legal matter had never tried to do it. The territorial land system was a web of competing interests, old loyalties, money, and the kind of institutional inertia that could crush any individual effort without even trying very hard. But Abigail was not an individual effort. She was a federally credentialed surveyor with a file of her father's original 1871 survey notes, a decade of follow-up correspondence, and a man whose name was on the fraudulent land grant now standing publicly beside her saying that the grant had been obtained dishonestly. Clarence's decision to cooperate was the thing that changed the calculus entirely. Without him, She would have been a woman from Boston making accusations against an established rancher. With him, she was half of a case that had a real chance of succeeding. They spent 3 days in the ranch house going through every document in the strongbox together, building a picture of what Harlan Calloway and Marcus Webb had done. Abigail was meticulous and organized in a way that made Clarence understand immediately why Edmund Norris had trained her specifically for this. She cataloged every letter, every date, every reference to the altered grant document. She cross-referenced the correspondence with the original survey notes her father had taken in 1871. She built a timeline that was clear and unassailable. Clarence watched her work and felt something in him loosen that had been tight for 3 years. On the second day, while she was comparing 2 letters against a notation in Edmund's survey journal, she said without looking up, "How did you manage to run a ranch while carrying this?" He was at the window, watching one of his cowboys ride the fence line in the long afternoon light. "Poorly," he said. "I drink more than I used to." She looked up then, and he saw her reassessing something. "But you stopped it," she said. "Whatever it would have taken to continue burying this, you stopped." "I allowed your permit to be revoked," he said. "That is not a thing I am proud of." "No," she agreed. "But you showed me the letters anyway." "I had already sent word to Fitch to restore your permit before you knocked on my door," he said. He had not told her this yet. "The morning you arrived, I had already decided. I just did not know you were coming that day. I thought I had more time to prepare what I wanted to say." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That was the honorable thing. It was 11 years overdue." "Yes," she said, "it was." And she went back to her work, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed, softened by some fraction that she would probably not have admitted to. The survey itself took 2 weeks. Abigail conducted it with Clarence riding alongside her as guide and witness, moving methodically along the boundary lines, taking measurements at every significant geographic feature, recording every result in the field journal her father had used in 1871, which she had brought with her from Boston. The country was rough and cold and spectacularly beautiful in the way of the high desert in early spring, the red rock glowing in the morning light, the scrub grass showing the first pale green of new growth, the sky above them an impossible deep blue that went on forever. She had never worked in country like this. All her training had been in the settled eastern landscape, rolling hills and river valleys and land that had been mapped and remapped until there was almost nothing left to discover. This country felt entirely different. It felt like the land was still deciding what it was going to be, still working itself out, and there was something about that openness that was both frightening and exhilarating. She told Clarence this one evening when they had stopped to make camp in a sheltered draw, because the return ride to the ranch would have put them back in the dark. And he had built a fire from the scrub wood, and they were sitting on either side of it waiting for the coffee to boil. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I do not know. Someone angrier maybe, or someone more frightened." "I am very angry," she said. "I am also very frightened. I just cannot afford to show either of those things because the moment I do, every man between here and Boston will decide they were right to dismiss me." He looked at her across the fire, and the firelight made his face do something complicated. "How long have you been doing that?" "Since I was about 16 and my father took me on my first survey and the other surveyors would not speak to me directly," she said. "You get very good at it." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark a nighthawk was calling. "Your father took you on surveys when you were 16, he asked." "He always took me everywhere he worked," she said, and her voice changed when she talked about Edmund, going quieter and more careful, the way you speak about someone you are still learning to carry the absence of. "He said I had better instincts for the instruments than anyone he had ever trained, and he had trained a dozen licensed surveyors." He was not being sentimental. He was stating a fact the way he stated everything, very directly and without decoration. She paused. "I miss him very much." "How long ago did he pass?" "February, less than 2 months." She had not said this to anyone since leaving Boston because there had been no one to say it to. Saying it out loud now, in this particular dark to this particular man, felt like releasing a pressure she had not known she was holding. Clarence set his coffee down and looked at the fire. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry you lost him, and I am sorry that some part of what you are doing here is about carrying him forward, and that my family's actions made that necessary." He looked up. "If I could change what my father did, I would." "I know," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. "I believe you. The survey results confirmed everything." They confirmed Edmund Norris's 1871 findings, with a precision that was almost painful in its exactness. The true eastern boundary of the Broken Spur land grant, as described in the original Spanish document before Harlan Calloway's alterations, ended at Redrock Creek. Everything east of Redrock Creek, approximately 800 acres of land including the secondary grazing pastures that Clarence had been using for 12 years, was public land. The water rights to Redrock Creek itself were public, not private. 3 families who had been squeezed off that land between 1872 and 1878 had been wrongfully displaced. Abigail wrote up her formal survey report at the desk in the ranch house study, the same desk where she had spread out her father's map on that first afternoon, and she did it with the thoroughness and precision that Edmund had drilled into her. She cited every measurement, every reference point, every corresponding entry in her father's 1871 journal. She appended the letters from the strongbox as supporting documentation. She wrote a formal statement from Clarence Calloway acknowledging the fraudulent alteration of the original grant document and requesting the land office to correct the official record. Clarence signed the statement without reading it again. He had read it twice and it said everything correctly, and he had decided to stop hesitating. "You understand what this means for the ranch," she said, watching him sign. "I lose 800 acres and the creek access." "Yes. The ranch will still function," he said. "It is smaller, it is honest. I can live with smaller and honest. I could not live with what I had before." He capped the pen and looked at her. "What happens to you after you submit this?" She had not thought very far past the submission. She had been so focused on getting to this moment that the landscape beyond it was unclear. "I go back to Boston, I suppose. There is the house to deal with." She did not say that the house was mortgaged twice, and that she would probably have to sell it and find a position somewhere, maybe a teaching post at one of the women's colleges that was beginning to include natural sciences in the curriculum. It was not a terrible future. It was just very far from this country and these red walls and this particular firelit study. "You could stay," Clarence said, and then immediately looked as if he had surprised himself by saying it, as if the words had gotten out ahead of his intentions. She looked at him very carefully. "There is plenty of survey work in the territory," he said, in the tone of a man trying to sound practical about something that was not entirely practical. "The land office in Santa Fe has been looking for licensed surveyors for 2 years, and you are the best I have ever seen work." He paused. "I mean that professionally, not as a means of keeping you here, although I would not object to keeping you here." There it was. He had said it. Abigail was a woman who had spent 11 years being trained to read what the physical world was actually telling you, not what you wanted it to tell you, not what the existing maps claimed, but what the instruments and the ground and the light and the water actually revealed if you looked clearly. She was very good at this. She had applied it to everything in her life, which was why she had recognized almost immediately that Clarence Calloway was not the villain of this story. She had also recognized, somewhere around the 3rd day of the survey, riding alongside him through a canyon passage where the walls rose 60 feet on either side, and the morning light hit the stone in colors she had never seen in any landscape before, that she was in serious danger of feeling something for this man that was going to make going back to Boston very difficult. "You are not objecting to keeping me here," she said. "No," he said, "I am not. You barely know me." "I know you well enough," he said. I know you rode 4,000 miles alone with your dead father's instruments to prove he was right. I know you work with a precision that is genuinely remarkable. I know you told me a truth about myself the night of the first day when you said that carrying the secret was the worst kind of prison, even though you were really talking about me, and you said it without being cruel. I know you laugh at very quiet things, small things, the horse doing something ridiculous or the way the cloud crossed the canyon, and you try to do it without being seen laughing, but you are not as subtle as you think you are. He stopped. He had said a great deal more than he intended. I do not want you to go back to Boston. Abigail sat with that for a very long moment. Then she said, I would need a proper position, something with actual professional standing. I am not staying in the territory as a guest. Of course not, he said quickly. The Land Office Commission is a real thing. I know the commissioner in Santa Fe. I can write the introduction. I can write my own introduction, she said with enough edge that he raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. Absolutely, he said. You can write your own introduction. She almost smiled. She was working very hard not to, and I would need suitable accommodation. I cannot continue staying at the boarding house in Harrow Creek indefinitely. The ranch house has a second wing, he said. It was my father's and it has been empty for 3 years. It is entirely separate, completely proper. He paused, for now. The last 2 words were very quiet. She heard them anyway. She looked out the window of the study at the long valley catching the late afternoon light, the red walls in the distance, the first green of spring pushing through the pale grass. It looked like a country that was worth staying in. I will think about it, she said. She submitted the survey report and Clarence's formal statement to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe the following week. Making the 2-day journey by hired coach, with all the documentation packed in a leather satchel, she kept on her lap the entire way. The clerk at the Santa Fe Land Office received the report with the particular wariness of someone who recognized that the document in front of him was going to create a great deal of paperwork and political difficulty for a great many people. The formal investigation that followed took 4 months. Gerald Fitch, the deputy land commissioner who had been on Calloway payroll, resigned his position the day after the survey report was filed, which was essentially an admission. Marcus Webb, the official who had originally facilitated the alteration of the Spanish land grant document in the 1860s, had died in 1878, which removed the most direct line of culpability but did not affect the factual record. The Territorial Land Court convened in June. Abigail testified for 3 hours about her survey methodology and findings. She was cross-examined by the attorney representing the Territorial Land Office's existing record, a man named Stroud who had clearly assumed he could rattle a woman with detailed technical questions, and who discovered within the first 20 minutes that he had profoundly underestimated the person across from him. Abigail answered every question with a clarity and specificity that made the courtroom very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone present understands they are watching something definitive. Clarence testified after her, and his testimony was brief and unequivocal. He confirmed the existence of the letters. He confirmed the contents of the strongbox. He confirmed that the land grant had been fraudulently obtained, and that he was formally renouncing the disputed 800 acres and the water rights to Red Rock Creek. He had his hat in his hands when he said it, and he did not look away from the judge's bench, and there was something in his bearing that was different from the way a man looks when he is defeated. He looked like someone who had just set down a weight he had been carrying for 3 years and was still getting used to the sensation of walking without it. The court ruled in July. The Broken Spur land grant was corrected to reflect the original Spanish boundary, ending at Red Rock Creek. The water rights to the creek were designated public. The 800 acres east of the creek were returned to the Public Land Registry. A formal notation was entered into the territorial record, acknowledging the fraudulent alteration and citing Edmund Norris's 1871 survey as the original accurate document of record. Edmund Norris had been right. After 11 years, someone had made it official. Abigail received the court decision in the mail at the Broken Spur Ranch, where she had in fact stayed after all, occupying the separate East Wing with a thoroughness and practicality that had somehow become, over the preceding months, the organizing center of her daily life. She read the document twice and then walked out onto the front porch and stood in the summer heat and looked at the valley, and she cried. She had earned it. She had absolutely earned it. She cried until she was empty, and then she felt clean, the way the air smells clean after a summer thunderstorm. And then she heard boots on the porch boards, and Clarence came and stood beside her without saying anything. And she turned and put her face against his chest, and he put his arms around her. And they stood like that for a long time in the afternoon heat while the court decision fluttered in her hand. He had not kissed her yet. They had been living in adjacent wings of the same ranch house for 4 months, and he had not kissed her, had been so scrupulously careful of her independence and her professional standing, and her right to be in that place on her own terms, that he had kept the appropriate distance even when every day of proximity made the distance feel more artificial. She had noticed this. She had found it both admirable and increasingly frustrating. He would not cross the line himself. That was clear. He was too careful of her, too aware of the power differential that came from her being on his land, in his house, conducting business that had been intertwined with his. He would not do anything that could look like he was using that advantage. It was either very noble or very annoying, and she had changed her mind about which one it was on a more or less daily basis. She was done waiting. She pulled back from his chest, looked up at him, and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of someone who had made a decision and was fully committed to it. And after 1 second of what appeared to be complete surprise, Clarence kissed her back with a thoroughness that made very clear that the careful distance of the past 4 months had not been for lack of wanting. When they separated, she looked at him and said, "I have wanted to do that for approximately 3 months. I have wanted to do that for approximately 4 months," he said. His voice was slightly unsteady. "I did not want to put you in a position where you felt you owed me anything for the land situation." "I do not owe you anything," she said. "You owed my father. We settled that through the court." "Yes," he said, and he was almost smiling now, which was a good look on him. "I am aware." "This is entirely separate," she said. "This is me choosing you, which is a thing I am doing freely and with full information." "I know," he said. "And this is me being unspeakably grateful for that choice." He took her hand. "Abigail, I know that we began in the hardest possible way, and that you came here for a purpose that had nothing to do with me, and I know that you have built something here in this territory that is yours and belongs to nothing I did or didn't do. I also know that I love you. I have known it for some time, and I did not say it because I was not sure it was welcome. And now I am saying it because you just kissed me, and I believe that changes the situation." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh at that particular moment, but he said it in such a completely sincere and slightly awkward way that the laugh simply came out of her, warm and real, and his whole face changed when she laughed, opened up and went soft in a way that she thought probably no one else ever got to see. "I love you too," she said. "Rather a lot, which is inconvenient considering how we started." "Highly inconvenient," he agreed. He was still holding her hand. He brought it up and pressed it very briefly to his mouth, a gesture so old-fashioned and careful that it made her chest ache. "I would like to court you properly, if that is agreeable." "Properly," she said. "Properly," he said firmly. "You deserve that." She considered him for a moment, this man who had given up 800 acres and a lifetime of fraudulent security, because it was the right thing to do, who had spent 4 months being scrupulously careful of her professional standing even when it must have been costing him something, who had kissed her back with unmistakable feeling, and was now asking to court her properly because she deserved it. "That is agreeable," she said. He took her out to supper at the hotel in Harrow Creek the following Saturday, which was the most presentable restaurant within 40 miles, and he wore his best coat, and she wore the green dress she had been saving for no particular occasion. And Pete Garza, the ranch foreman, made a comment as they left that caused Clarence's ears to go red in a way she filed away for future reference. Harrow Creek was a small town of approximately 200 people, and a small town being what it was, there was nothing subtle about Clarence Calloway bringing Abigail Norris to supper at the hotel. Everyone in the restaurant knew who she was. Some of them had opinions about the lawsuit. Most of those opinions, Abigail had learned over the past months, were considerably more sympathetic to her position than she had initially expected, because the Calloway family's history of using the fraudulent water rights to squeeze out smaller landholders was not entirely unknown in the area. A woman named Clara Whitmore, who ran the dry goods store and was approximately the social center of Harrow Creek, stopped at their table and shook Abigail's hand and said that what she had done for the territory was something worth noting, and that the Norris name ought to be remembered as an honest one. Abigail thanked her and meant it, and afterward at the table she was quieter for a few minutes. "What are you thinking?" Clarence asked. "My father," she said. "I wish he could have known that the name was remembered as honest." She looked at her wine glass. "He spent 11 years worrying that he had failed, that the survey he submitted had been buried and no one would ever know what he had actually found." "He didn't fail," Clarence said. "He raised you to do it for him." She looked at him. "He spent 11 years teaching you everything he knew," Clarence said. "That was not failure. That was the longest possible plan." She pressed her lips together and looked away for a moment at the window, at the main street of Harrow Creek in the summer evening, the horses at the hitching posts and the yellow light coming from the saloon across the way, and then she looked back at him and said, "You are unexpectedly good at saying the right thing." "I try," he said. "You succeed more often than you probably know." They walked back from the hotel in the long summer twilight, the sky still holding purple and orange in the west long after the sun was down, because summer evenings in the high desert were endless and generous in a way that was not like anything she had experienced in New England. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked the length of Harrow Creek's main street with her hand on his arm, and it was such an ordinary and domestic thing, so unlike every fraught confrontational day since she had arrived in the territory, that she felt a particular tenderness for the ordinariness of it. The courtship proceeded with the combination of genuine propriety and increasing impatience that characterized any romantic situation where both parties were entirely clear about their feelings, but committed to doing things correctly. Clarence rode to Harrow Creek every Saturday and took her to supper. He rode with her when she was working survey commissions in the area, partly because he knew the country and could guide her efficiently, and partly because he simply wanted to be where she was. She began keeping some of her instruments and field journals in the ranch house study rather than carrying them back and forth to the East Wing every morning, which was practical and also significant. The Land Office Commission came through in August. It was a proper federal appointment. Abigail Norris as licensed independent surveyor for the Territorial Land Office, covering a district that included the Harrow Creek area and the surrounding country. She was the only woman holding such a commission in the New Mexico Territory, which was a distinction she acknowledged without making a great deal of it, because she found that making a great deal of it tended to invite people to argue about whether she deserved it rather than simply accepting that she was the most qualified person for the work. The work itself was everything she had hoped it would be. The territory was full of disputed boundaries, unclear grants, old Spanish documents that had been translated and retranslated with varying degrees of accuracy, and the complicated overlay of homesteading claims on top of pre-existing treaty agreements that the federal government had been systematically ignoring. There was enough work for a dozen competent surveyors, and she was doing the work of 3, riding out 5 days a week with her instruments and her field journal, and coming back in the evenings with the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from doing something that mattered. She also began, quietly, to compile a record of the 3 families who had been displaced from the land east of Red Rock Creek in the 1870s. The Halloran family had moved to Arizona. The Espinoza family was still in the territory, working as tenant farmers on someone else's land. The 3rd family, the Pierces, had left the territory entirely and could not be traced. She wrote a formal report to the Territorial Land Office, recommending that the now public land east of Red Rock Creek be made available for homestead claim, with priority given to families who had previously held claims in the area. And she included the Espinoza family specifically by name. The land office sat on the recommendation for 6 weeks. Then they approved it. The Espinoza family, Mateo and Rosa Espinoza and their 4 children, filed a homestead claim on 60 acres east of Red Rock Creek in September. They were the first family to farm that land honestly in a decade. Clarence rode out to meet them when they arrived. Abigail came with him. They helped the Espinoza family unload their wagon and talked with Mateo about the soil and the water access, and where the best placement for a house would be relative to the creek. And Rosa Espinoza made coffee over an open fire and pressed a cup into Abigail's hands and said, in the mix of Spanish and English that served as the general currency of the territory, that she had been praying for 10 years that someone would do what this young woman had done. Abigail drank the coffee and held the tin cup and thought about her father, and thought it was possible he could have known after all, that the things we do in good faith travel further and land in places we cannot always see. On the ride back to the ranch that evening, the autumn light already going gold in the way that high desert light does in September, Clarence said, "You are a remarkable woman, Abigail Norris." "You say that regularly," she said, "because it is regularly true." She looked at him, riding beside her on the gray horse he favored, his hat pushed back slightly in the informal way of a man on his own land at the end of a good day, and she thought very clearly, "I want to stay here, not just in the territory. Here with him in this life. I want this to be my life," she said. "I want to stop living in the East Wing." He looked at her very quickly. "I mean that in the direction you are thinking," she said clearly, "not in the direction of moving out." "Abigail," he said, and his voice had gone the quiet way it did when he was feeling something large. "Are you asking me to?" "I am asking you to ask me something," she said, "because I believe you have been working up to it for approximately 3 months and I am running out of patience." He pulled his horse to a stop. She pulled hers to a stop. They were in the middle of the open valley with the creek visible in the distance and the canyon walls going red in the afternoon light and the sky enormous above them, and he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small box that he clearly had in fact been carrying for some time. "I bought this in Santa Fe in June," he said, "when I came to hear the court decision." She stared at him. "I was not going to produce it without being very certain of the welcome," he said. "But I have been carrying it for 3 months. That is a very long time to carry a ring," she said. "I am a patient man." He opened the box. It was a simple ring, a garnet set in yellow gold, not extravagant, not flashy, the kind of thing you chose when you knew the person you were buying for had no patience for pretension. "Abigail Norris, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at the valley and the creek and the red walls in the distance. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I have been saying yes in every possible way except the actual word for 2 months." He laughed, and it was a full laugh, free and unguarded, which was something she had only heard from him rarely, and which she intended to hear far more of in the future. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand against the rains and the late gold light, and it was exactly right. They were married in November of 1882 in the Harrow Creek Church, which was a modest adobe structure with a wooden cross above the door, and a congregation of about 60 people who had driven or ridden in from the surrounding ranches and homesteads for the occasion. Clara Whitmore had organized the reception dinner with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for the territory to provide her with something genuinely celebratory. Pete Garza, who had the weathered face of a man who had worked outdoors for 30 years, and the secret soft heart of someone who had watched Clarence Calloway be alone for too long, shook Abigail's hand at the reception, with an expression that clearly communicated that he approved, and that Clarence had better not do anything to make her leave. Abigail wore the green dress she had worn to the hotel supper, because it was her best dress and it fit, and she carried a small bunch of late autumn flowers that someone had managed to find despite the season, and she walked into the church on her own arm because there was no father to walk with her. But she held her head up, and she did not need anyone to notice that she was holding it up because she had decided she was simply walking. When she reached the front of the church and stood beside Clarence and looked at his face, she saw something she had not expected to see. She had expected happiness, which was present. She had expected nerves, which were also present, in the slight tension around his jaw. What she had not expected was the particular expression of someone who has spent a long time believing that they do not deserve something good, suddenly finding themselves in possession of it, and not quite able to believe it was real. She reached out and took his hand before the minister began, which was not the usual order of things, and he held it very tightly, and they looked at each other, and she thought, "We started in the worst possible place. We started with betrayal and hidden motives and dark legacies and a map on the floor between us. And here we are." The minister's words washed over her. She said the right things at the right times. Clarence said his vows with a steadiness that did not waver, looking at her the entire time. When they were done, the congregation clapped, and Clara Whitmore may have cried, and Pete Garza definitely did not cry, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was the warmest winter Clarence said he had seen in 10 years, the kind of fall spring that the high desert occasionally gifted its inhabitants, clear days and cold nights, and a sky that seemed impossibly close and brilliant. They rode the boundary lines of the reduced broken spur together in December, Abigail with her compass and her journal, Clarence knowing every foot of the land, and she documented the corrected boundaries formally for the ranch's own records. It was the most unnecessary survey she had ever conducted in professional terms, and the one she felt most clearly about on a personal level. She was also, by January, clearly pregnant. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, over coffee, with the directness that she brought to everything. He sat down quite suddenly and looked at her with an expression that moved rapidly from surprise to something so openly joyful that she felt it like warmth across the room. "When?" he managed. "July, I believe," she said. "I am not going to stop working, Clarence." "I did not say a word," he said. "You were about to." "I was absolutely not," he said. "I was going to say that you should tell the land office so they can plan around any field work that requires very rough terrain in the later months." She looked at him. "I know you," he said simply. "I know you are going to work. I just want you to be safe." "That is a reasonable thing," she said. "Thank you," he said. She worked until May. She conducted 3 survey commissions in February and a boundary review in March that required 2 days of riding, and she made practical adjustments where her body required them, and ignored the rest with the determination that had characterized everything else she had ever done. The land office was adjusting to having a woman in the surveyor's role anyway. This was one more adjustment. In April, she got a letter from Clara Whitmore's contact in Boston, a woman who had been a friend of Edmund Norris's in professional circles, saying that the territorial court's decision had been reported in several Eastern newspapers, and that Edmund Norris's name had been mentioned as the originating surveyor whose work had ultimately been validated. The papers called it a significant correction of a long-standing territorial land injustice. One paper used the phrase, "the legacy of an honest man's work." Abigail read that phrase standing in the ranch house study and pressed the letter flat against her chest and stood for a moment in the morning light coming through the window that looked out over the valley, and she talked to her father the way she had taken to doing when she had something important to tell him. She told him they had remembered his name correctly. She told him she was going to be a mother in a few months, and that she had found the most unexpectedly good man in the last place she would have thought to look. She told him she was happy, which was not something she had imagined being able to say when she had stood in his study the morning after his funeral and looked at the map on his desk and the letter beside it. Clarence found her there a few minutes later. She showed him the letter. He read it and looked at the phrase about the legacy of an honest man's work, and he said, "He would have been proud of you. He would have been very particular about the survey methodology described in the article," she said. "He would have written a letter to the paper correcting 3 technical inaccuracies," Clarence smiled, "and then he would have been proud of you." "Yes," she said, "and then." Their son was born in July of 1883, in the middle of a thunderstorm that had come in off the mountains, and was rolling through the valley in great rolling waves of rain and lightning that made the adobe walls shake pleasantly. The birth was attended by the doctor from Harrow Creek, a capable man named Dr. Yates who had been practicing frontier medicine for 15 years and had seen enough to be unflappable about almost everything. Clarence spent the duration in the kitchen going between useful and useless in approximately equal measure, which Pete Garza later described as the most entertainment the ranch house had provided in years. The baby was healthy and loud, and had Abigail's dark eyes and Clarence's breadth of shoulder, which was an interesting combination in a newborn, and she looked at him in the first exhausted minutes after, and felt the particular astonishment of people who have held their own child for the first time, and understood that the world has expanded in a direction they had not previously known existed. They named him Edmund Clarence Calloway, which was the only name either of them had considered from the beginning. Edmund grew the way frontier children grow, which is faster and tougher and more competent than anyone from a settled place expects. By the time he was 2, he was following Pete Garza around the ranch with the fixed determination of a very small person who has decided on a trajectory and will not be diverted, and Pete Garza, who maintained his gruff exterior with the conviction of a man who had been doing so for 40 years, had developed the habit of arriving at whatever task he was doing that day with an extra small portion of whatever he was eating, which was not a thing he mentioned or acknowledged. Abigail continued her work for the Territorial Land Office. She was developing a reputation throughout the territory as someone who could be trusted to give an honest reading of complicated boundary situations, and she had the somewhat unusual professional distinction of being someone that both homesteading families and established ranchers respected, because she had demonstrated that her honesty operated in all directions, that she called the land as she found it regardless of who benefited. This was not a common quality in any professional engaged in land disputes in the 1880s West, and it was worth more than any number of technical credentials. She also began a project in the evenings, when Edmund was asleep and Clarence was doing his accounts at the desk in the study, writing up a formal monograph about survey methodology in the territorial system. It was not a personal document, and it was not a polemic about land fraud. It was a technical work, carefully organized, drawing on her 10 years of training under Edmund and her 2 years of active field work in the territory, addressing the specific challenges of conducting accurate surveys in the conditions of the American Southwest. She wrote it in the evenings over the course of 8 months, carefully, and with the precision that characterized everything she did, and she sent it in the spring of 1884 to a federal land office publication in Washington that her father had contributed to. They published it in full. It ran in 2 consecutive issues of the Proceedings of the Federal Land Survey Office and was cited 17 times in the following 2 years. Edmund Norris was thanked in the opening acknowledgement as the foundation of the methodology described. The monograph would go on to be referenced in land surveying instruction for decades. Clarence read it when the issues arrived in the mail and said nothing for a long time and then said, Your father would have written a letter to the editor identifying 3 inaccuracies in the editorial notes. Yes, she said, and then he would have been proud. And then, Clarence agreed. In the spring of 1884, Mateo Espinosa came to the Broken Spur with his eldest son to talk about water management along Red Rock Creek. Because the creek's flow had been lower than usual that winter, and the question of how to manage the public water rights during dry seasons was one that affected several landholders in the area. Clarence and Abigail hosted the Espinosas for supper, and the conversation over the table covered creek management and then broader land questions. And then, somehow, the larger situation of the families in the territory who were navigating complicated land situations. Mateo was a thoughtful man with 20 years of experience farming this country, and he and Clarence built a working relationship that afternoon that lasted the rest of their lives, because they were in fact neighbors now in the truest sense, sharing the water and the land, and the practical reality of making a life in a difficult and beautiful country. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that hit the whole region hard. The creek ran low. The grass in the valley went pale and dry weeks earlier than usual. Clarence spent long days managing the herd, moving cattle to the sections of the ranch with the best remaining grass, making the decisions that a rancher in a dry year spends every waking hour making. He came home in the evenings tired in the deep way of someone who is carrying the weight of something living that depends on him, and Abigail met him with food and coffee, and the kind of steady presence that was its own form of support. She also, in August of that dry summer, quietly rode the eastern boundary of the Broken Spur along Red Rock Creek and took careful measurements of the creek flow at regular intervals, recording everything in her field journal. Then she wrote a report for the Territorial Water Commission, suggesting 3 specific improvements to the creek's upstream management that would improve low-flow conditions for all landholders in the area. The improvements were practical and inexpensive, and drew on similar work that had been done in other parts of the territory, and she cited every source. The Water Commission implemented 2 of the 3 recommendations the following spring. The creek's summer flow improved measurably. Clarence found out about it from the Water Commissioner's letter thanking the Territorial Land Office for the Calloway Survey report, which arrived at the ranch house addressed to Abigail Norris Calloway. He read it while she was out on a survey commission and was sitting with it on the front porch when she rode back in the late afternoon. The Water Commission letter came, he said. Ah, she said, dismounting. You did not mention you had submitted a report to the Water Commission. I did it in August, she said. You were managing the herd situation, and I did not want to add anything to your plate that was not immediately practical. He looked at her for a long moment. It was just a survey report, she said. Technical, straightforward. Abigail, he said, you spent your own time in the middle of a drought that was keeping both of us up at night, surveying the creek so you could tell the Territorial Commission how to fix the water flow. Someone needed to, she said. You never stop, he said, and there was something in his voice that was beyond admiration, that was in the territory of awe, the feeling of being next to something larger than yourself and understanding it fully. My father never stopped, she said. I suppose it is hereditary. He stood up from the porch chair and crossed to her and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her with the same thoroughness he had brought to that first kiss 14 months ago, and she kissed him back with the settled warmth of 2 people who have learned each other completely and still find the learning interesting. I love you, he said against her hair. I know, she said. I love you too, immoderately, which I believe you already know. I am aware, he said. I count it the greatest fortune of my life. Edmund turned 2 that July, running in the ranch yard with the specific purposeful energy of a small child who has learned that the world is very large and very interesting, and that his legs, if applied vigorously enough, can cover a significant portion of it. He had his grandmother's name, Clarence's mother, somewhere in his bearing, something about the set of his jaw that Clarence occasionally caught, and that made him feel the particular sweet ache of people you have lost who continue to exist in the people you love. By September of 1884, Abigail knew they were going to have another child. She told Clarence at breakfast, again with directness, and again he sat down with the expression of someone encountering wonderful news that had nevertheless caught him slightly off guard. She was approximately the same time along as she had been with Edmund when she had told him, and she expected the same response. What she got instead was Clarence standing back up very quickly, crossing the kitchen, and lifting her out of her chair and holding her in a way that was thorough and uncomplicated, and entirely without his usual care about keeping appropriate boundaries that had been entirely irrelevant since their wedding 2 years ago, but which he sometimes still defaulted to out of long habit. "You are happy," she said into his shoulder. "I am beyond happy," he said. "I did not know there was a word for beyond happy." "There probably is in several languages," she said. "German almost certainly." He laughed, and the laugh moved through her where she was pressed against his chest, and she thought, this is what a life is supposed to be. Their daughter was born in April of 1885, in the same bedroom where Edmund had been born, during a clear night with no drama at all, arriving so efficiently that Dr. Yates said she was the most sensible patient he had attended all year. She had Clarence's blue-gray eyes and Abigail's dark hair, and an expression of alert, assessing attention that was visible from her first hour, and that Clarence said was absolutely her mother's expression, the one she wore when she was about to tell you something definitive. They named her Eleanor after no one in particular, because the name felt right and strong, and like something the child would grow into with ease. Edmund was fascinated by Eleanor in the way that 2-year-olds are fascinated by new things, intensely and with an agenda. He brought her things, rocks primarily, also a stick that he considered particularly good. Pete Garza, whose stoic exterior continued to erode at a pace that everyone on the ranch had tracked and no one mentioned, taught Edmund to say Eleanor's name correctly, which took 3 weeks but was accomplished with a thoroughness that suggested Edmund Calloway, when he decided to do a thing, would do it correctly. Life at the Broken Spur in the mid-1880s was not easy. Ranching in the high desert was never easy. There were dry years and difficult winters and cattle prices that fluctuated in ways connected to markets 3,000 miles away. Clarence managed all of it with the steady competence of someone who understood that the land was not going to be kind to you just because you worked hard. You worked hard because the land required it, and if you were lucky and smart and occasionally fortunate with the weather, you built something that lasted. Abigail continued her survey work and her writing. She published 2 more technical pieces in the Federal Land Office proceedings. She consulted on 3 significant boundary disputes in the territory, 2 of which involved complicated Spanish land grant questions similar to the Broken Spur situation. In both cases, she found what the land actually showed her, reported it accurately, and declined to be influenced by which side of the dispute had more money. In 1886, she was asked by the territorial governor's office to serve on an advisory committee, reviewing the process for translating and verifying old Spanish land grant documents, a direct consequence of the Broken Spur case, and the broader questions it had raised about how many similar fraudulent translations might exist in the territorial record. She served on the committee for 2 years, traveling to Santa Fe 3 times for formal sessions, and handling the rest by correspondence from the ranch house study, where Edmund Norris had taught her to work. Clarence went with her to Santa Fe when she presented the committee's preliminary findings to the territorial government in 1887. He sat in the back of the room, wearing his best coat, watching his wife stand before a room full of territorial officials and lawyers and land agents, and present her findings with the same clear, precise, absolutely unintimidatable authority that she had brought to every professional situation since the day she had walked up to his ranch house door with her father's compass in her hand. Afterward, in the hotel dining room, he said, "Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he trained you." "He knew the instruments," she said. "He also knew me." "He also loved you very much," Clarence said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, he did, and I carry that." She looked at Clarence across the table, the man she had fought and distrusted and come to love in this hard and beautiful country at the bottom of the world. "I carry all of it, and it is not heavy anymore. It is just mine." The broken spur continued to grow and change in the way that working ranches grow and change, slowly, with effort, building through the accumulation of small good decisions over time. Clarence expanded the cattle operation in 1887 with a new breeding program that improved the quality of his herd, working with a neighbor to the south on a collective approach to selling cattle to the eastern markets that gave them both more negotiating power than either could achieve alone. The ranch was smaller than it had been before the land correction, but it was profitable and honest, and he slept without the weight of the strongbox under the floorboards, which was worth more than the 800 acres. Pete Garza, who had worked the broken spur for 22 years by 1887, began slowing down in the way of a man who has spent his whole life working hard, and whose body is beginning to offer its opinion about that decision. Clarence offered him a reduced role that still kept him on the ranch, because the alternative was not something he was willing to consider. Pete accepted with the dignity of someone who had been waiting to be asked, and had been determined not to ask himself. He continued to appear wherever Edmund and Alina happened to be playing, with no stated intention of doing so, and continued to maintain that this had nothing to do with any particular fondness for the children. Edmund started school in Harrow Creek in 1888, riding into town 3 days a week with one of the ranch hands who made the supply run on those days, and demonstrating in the schoolroom the same fixed determination he brought to everything else. He was not the easiest student the schoolteacher, a patient woman named Miss Brennan, had encountered, because he had opinions about things and expressed them directly, which was a quality his mother recognized and his father found simultaneously admirable and quietly amusing. Alina, at 3 and then 4, was quieter than her brother but more observant. She followed Abigail around the ranch house and the yard with the focused attention of someone taking notes, and she had picked up the habit of holding small objects very carefully in both hands and examining them with concentration, which Clarence said made her look exactly like her mother with a surveying instrument. Abigail had taken to occasionally bringing the children out with her on shorter survey commissions, when the terrain and conditions were appropriate, carrying Alina in a carrier on her back in the early years, and letting Edmund ride beside her on his own small horse as he got older. She talked to them about what she was doing, explained the compass and the measuring chain, described why the boundary markers mattered, what the land was telling you, and how you listened to it. She had not decided to train them as surveyors. She was simply telling them about the world as she knew it, the way her father had told her. In the late summer of 1889, New Mexico Territory received word that it was being considered for statehood, which was something the territorial government had been pursuing for years, and which had complicated political implications for every land-holding interest in the region. The question of unresolved land grants and boundary disputes took on new urgency in the context of statehood, because the moment New Mexico became a state, the federal oversight mechanisms that had been managing territorial land questions would change significantly. Abigail was asked to provide her committee's full report to the Federal Land Office in Washington as part of the statehood review process. She spent 3 months completing and expanding the report, incorporating everything the advisory committee had found about fraudulent grant translations and the process failures that had allowed them to stand for decades. She was thorough and she was precise, and she was also, by this point, deeply experienced in exactly the political and institutional pressures that could cause honest survey work to be buried. And she wrote the report in a way that made it as difficult as possible to bury without attracting attention. Clarence read the completed report the night before she packaged it for sending, sitting beside her in the study with Edmund's drawings covering one end of the desk and Alina asleep upstairs and the fire burning low in the fireplace. He read it from first page to last, and then set it down and said nothing for a moment. "Well," she said. Her father would have written a letter to himself correcting 4 inaccuracies in his own survey notes, and then revised the conclusions of the report to accommodate them, he said, and then been very proud. She looked at him with the full force of everything she felt, which was considerable. "And I," he said, meeting her look with the steadiness that had been one of the first things she had recognized in him, and one of the last things she expected to find in the man she had come to confront. "I'm very proud. Every single day." New Mexico was admitted to the Union as a state in 1912, many years after the events of 1882, and the work that Abigail's committee had done on the grant translation process contributed to the legal frameworks that governed that transition. But in the autumn of 1889, what mattered was the report being sent, and the territory's land questions being put on record clearly. What also mattered was the evening she and Clarence spent after the report was sealed and packaged, sitting on the front porch in the September dark with coffee, watching the last of the summer stars wheel overhead in a sky so clear and deep it looked like something you could fall into. "Do you remember when I rode up to this porch the first time?" she said. "I remember everything about that day," he said. "I remember the compass in your hand. I remember thinking that you were either the bravest person I had ever met or the most alarmed, and I could not tell which." "Both," she said. "Simultaneously." "Both," he agreed. "I also remember thinking that whatever was about to happen was going to be either very bad or very significant, and that I had better pay attention." "Very significant," she said. "Extraordinarily significant," he said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and held it in the easy, habitual way of 2 people who have been holding hands for 7 years and still find it worth doing. "My whole life changed that day." "So did mine," she said. "For the better." She turned and looked at him in the dark. This man she had come to fight and found instead to be the person willing to stand up beside her and tell the truth at cost to himself. This man who had loved her with a steadiness and a care that had given her room to be entirely herself. This man who held their children with a gentleness that made her chest ache. This man whose land she had mapped and whose secrets she had surfaced and whose future she had built alongside her own in a country that was harsh and beautiful and theirs. "Incomparably for the better," she said. "Everything before it was practice." He brought her hand to his mouth in that same careful gesture he had made on the porch of the Broken Spur in their courtship, the old-fashioned tenderness he sometimes still fell back to, and she let him, and the night was quiet around them, the canyon walls dark against the stars, the creek somewhere in the distance doing what it had always done, running honest over the stones in the dark. They sat like that for a long time, the 2 of them on the porch of the Broken Spur, while the territory spread out around them in the enormous September night, waiting to be mapped. Edmund Calloway grew up to be a surveyor, as it turned out, though he came to it in his own time and his own way. He showed up at 17 with the particular decisive manner of someone who has been watching a thing for years and has decided they are ready, and asked his mother to teach him everything she knew. She did. She taught him with the same thoroughness and precision that Edmund Norris had brought to teaching her, and he turned out to have the instincts for the work that Edmund Norris had said were either taught or inborn, and she believed were both. Alina did not become a surveyor. Alina, at 18, had the sharp and assessing mind of her mother applied to an entirely different domain. She became the best bookkeeper the Territorial Land Office had ever employed, which they discovered when she started working there at 16 to earn her own money, and she reorganized their filing system within a year in a way that made every boundary dispute significantly faster to resolve, because she had created a cross-referencing system that connected grant documents with survey records and court decisions. The land commissioner wrote to Abigail personally to say that Eleanor Calloway had saved the office approximately 400 hours of clerical work per year. Abigail passed the letter to Clarence without comment, with the particular expression of someone who is very pleased and has decided that being obvious about it would undercut the dignity of the situation. Clarence read it and said nothing for a moment. "She reorganized the entire land office filing system," he said. "She did," Abigail said. "At 16. She has always been very efficient," Abigail said. He looked at his wife across the breakfast table, at this woman who had ridden 4,000 miles with a dead man's compass, and a map on her back to prove a truth that the whole system had been arranged to hide, who had loved him through every difficulty of the years that followed, who had raised 2 children in a hard and beautiful country, and taught them both to be honest and capable and unafraid of the truth the world was actually showing them. "Your father," he said, "was a man who built things that lasted." She looked at him with the amber eyes that he had been looking into for 9 years and finding new things in on a regular basis. "So are you," she said. He thought about that. He thought about the map on the floor between them on the first day, and the letters in the strongbox, and the court that had set the record straight, and the Espinosas farming their 60 acres along the creek, and the water running honest through the valley, and the 2 children who were somewhere on the ranch in the early morning doing whatever they were doing with the full commitment they brought to everything. "So are you," he said back to her. The Broken Spur Ranch stood for another 100 years after that morning. The boundary lines, corrected and verified by Abigail Norris Calloway's own hand, and filed in the territorial record and later the state record, never shifted again. The map that Edmund Norris had drawn stayed in the study, framed eventually under glass when the paper began to show the stress of time, on the wall above the desk where 2 generations of Calloways would sit and do the work of building something honest in the beautiful, difficult country at the edge of the world. And Red Rock Creek ran on, clear and free and public, through all the years, the water belonging to everyone and no one, the way water ought to belong, the way the best things do.